Hello and welcome to the PMA Consulting webinar. I'm David Sykes from PMA Consulting, joined by my colleague Giovanni Pisa to share our thoughts on patient centricity and how to shape value from a HTA and market access perspective. Patients have been involved in drug development for a long time in order to improve patient outcomes in various different forms. Over the last few years, we've started to see more patient engagement at the value level, whether this be in the HTA setting or more recently within the context of the emerging value frameworks. Within HTA, there is significant variability across countries, but it is clear that the trend shows an increased appetite for patient engagement across a broad spectrum of stakeholders who make decisions on approval of and access to new medicines. In this webinar, we will argue that the role of the patient is changing and can have a powerful impact on developing value propositions and access decision-making. The key topics that will be covered in this webinar are laid out on this slide. So firstly, we'll introduce the concept of patient centricity, its role in HTA and outline that with some examples, and provide a framework for patient engagement, and then also share some summary perspectives. We'll then open up for questions. At the end of this presentation, as I say, we'll have some time for some questions. So please type your question in the lower box on the dash panel as illustrated on this slide. We will aim to answer all questions. If time does not permit a response, then we will get back to those individuals after the webinar. Please note that questions will only be visible to the PMA team. Thanks, Giovanni.
Thank you, David. So let's start with a short introduction to the concept and definition of patient centricity. Patient centricity is a concept which has been subject to different interpretations and definitions in the last several years. And when thinking about how to produce more value with medicines and thus making a difference for patients, it is clear that different stakeholders require a more patient-centric approach to drug development, including payers, regulators, and of course patients themselves. So to achieve better outcomes for patients, attempts have been made to engage them in the drug development, especially in early development phases. As mentioned, patient centricity has had many interpretations so far, mainly depending really on the eye of the beholder. So for example, it's about listening to patient voice and engaging with them and their advocates through partnerships when we look, for example, at a general point of view from the industry. Then there might be the view specifically from clinical departments, for example, around endpoints, patient-reported outcomes, or even real-world evidence generation when discussing about long-term value of products. And then again, some others might speak about the empowered patient within the digital world. So really different concepts and different definitions depending on the angles from which we observe and we look at patient centricity. Recently, a pharmaceutical company, AstraZeneca, took care to develop a definition of patient centricity, which is putting the patient first in an open and sustained engagement of the patient to respectfully and compassionately achieve the best experience and outcome for that person and his or her family. So the definition was co-developed with patients and caregivers using research led by AstraZeneca and patient advocates. And the definition includes 5 aspects identified as really being relevant for patients. And these are inclusiveness, then the idea of sharing goals that are patient and family centered, the empowerment of patients to take control of their own health, and then considerations regarding the work and the cooperation between parties, And this work must be respectful, compassionate, and open, and also really seen as a partnership. So if we look at a couple of aspects of the definition, for example, open and sustained engagement, this reflects the need to act really transparently in all interactions with patients, and to really try to remain consistent in the relationships with patients, rather than having project-based approaches. Respectfully really reflects the need to have a mutual understanding between both parties and to understand sometimes different point of views. And also the word compassionately or compassionate underlines the need to empathize with the patient as a person, their condition, and the impact this condition has on their lives. But at the same time, recognizing them as valuable contribution to inform healthcare decisions. So patient centricity should be really at the core of the drug life cycle, and this is really the aim of producing medicines with more value and better outcomes for patients. And so the needs and their preferences and their priorities must be understood and considered when incorporating them along the drug development process. But this, of course, has greater opportunities, but offers also challenges as this is a really complex process of drug development. A patient-centric approach to medicine should be applied throughout the whole drug life cycle, as we mentioned, starting with drug development, for example, in clinical trials, in the design of protocols, in the development of patient-reported outcomes, and informed consent documents. And then also during regulatory and marketing authorization phase, where big developments have been made with HTA and EMA. For example, EMA, where we have patient representatives in the management board, scientific committees, and these are consulted by the working parties in the preparation of guidelines. FDA, where we recently have the creation of the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee set up in 2017 by the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And this is really the first committee composed uniquely from patients and their carers. And this committee provides basically advice to the commissioner on complex issues relating to medical devices, the regulation of devices, and their use by patients. And the committee deals normally with topics such as guidance and policies, clinical trial or registry design, patient preference studies, benefit risk determinations and assessments, device labeling, etc., etc. And also what must be said is that there is an increasing effort to cooperate between the two agencies, so FDA and EMA, with the creation of the so-called cluster on patient engagement. And this cluster would provide a forum to share experiences and best practices on the way that these two agencies involve patients in the development, evaluation, and post-authorization activities related to medicines. And if we look at the HR and market access piece, we will be talking about this in a few minutes. So when looking really at the whole drug life cycle process, we certainly have areas where patient involvement is more established, areas where the patient has been involved most recently, but also a bunch of other areas and initiatives where patient could be involved even more. So patient advisory groups already provide input on, for example, unmet needs, protocol design, conduction of clinical trials, data interpretation, data dissemination, risk-benefit discussions, risk management plans, and in general, the interpretation of value of treatment relevant to conversations, for example, with payers. Nonetheless, the level of input from patients and the frameworks used to gain this input and the implications also of their input are not really consistent across the industry. So if we look at the opportunities for greater patient involvement, for example, definitely in general a greater understanding of the disease area, particularly in early discovery phases and development, but also patient preference assessment, and also the inclusion of patient, for example, on advisory committees, contributing to benefit risk assessments and discussions. So let's now have a look at patient centricity, focusing on the HTA processes. As you know, HTAs are a critical component when assessing the value of new interventions to inform policymaking for health resource allocation. So the question is, how do we define values? As new treatments are developed to ultimately improve outcomes for patients in their life, the views of the patients are certainly the most important. And there are issues around patient and public involvement in HTA, which are normally discussed under the general umbrella of PPI, so patient-public involvement. However, a distinction must be made between patients and the public, as their interests are not always aligned and sometimes can be even conflicting. Patients, of course, are the users or beneficiaries of health technologies and have experience with the disease and with the health technology in assessment. The public, on the other hand, is made of those members of a wider community who have really interest in the well-being and sustainability of the health system, but surely lack a personal experience with the health condition and the health technology under assessment. So when we look at the reasons of involving patients in HTAs, we have mainly two sets of reasons for involving patients. The first set of reasons has to do with transparency, legitimacy, and fairness, because patient participation in HTA is a way to increase the trust in the whole HTA decision-making process and even increase the acceptance of the resulting decisions. And the other set of reasons has to do with evidentiary contribution, meaning that the patient can deliver valuable first-hand knowledge about the disease from their experience of living with the condition on a daily basis, and can deliver, of course, important insights about the technology under assessment based on their experience, their needs, and their preferences with regard to the product. So when looking at incorporating patients' values and preferences into HTAs, there are a couple of different ways this can be accomplished. As you see on the left-hand side, the classic patient-reported outcome measures in clinical trials, for example, measuring quality of life with different questionnaires and tools. Patient preference data, measuring the value attached by patient, for example, to a specific health state or intervention attributes via discrete choice experiments, for example, or willingness to pay methodologies. And then what we will be looking at in more detail today, direct patient involvement, so really the patient participation and consultation within the HTA process. So with this board just taking place a few weeks ago, we could really observe a lot of discussion around the topic of patient advocacy, patient engagement, and as well as patient engagement in HTAs and market access processes. All in all, we can see that the use of patient group submissions in HTAs has increased over the years, and these, including patients, tend to correlate with positive recommendations. So if we look at the development from 2009 to 2016, we have an increase of HTAs involving patient group submissions from 20 to 50% and up to 72% in hematology, for example. And considering the impact of involving patient group submissions in HTAs, we have almost basically 2/3 of HTAs resulting in a positive decision, compared to 54% of HTAs not involved in patient group submissions. And looking specifically at NICE and the SMC, around 70% of the HTAs resulted in positive recommendation when patient group submissions were involved. So overall, a good trend, a positive development, and a reason to consider including patients and patient groups more often in HTAs. Talking about patient advocates and patient advocacy groups, the voice of patient advocates from different groups has become louder definitely in the last few years. And latest with the initiatives like UPATI, it has become clear that patients and their advocates do really ask to be involved when developing new drugs to make sure that issues are addressed that are relevant to them. It's a fact that patients are becoming more knowledgeable and networks have been created to allow more exchange of experiences in the patient's community. So when setting up the involvement of patient advocacy groups, it is important really to consider this and acknowledge that most of these groups are really experts in their disease area and can deliver valuable input into your activities. Here you see two quotes from well-known patient advocates. Jan Geisler, for example, is among others, director of the UPATI initiative, and Bettina Riel, among others, chair of the ESMO Patient Advocates Working Group. In a study conducted by PRMA Consulting about the involvement of patient advocacy groups in real-world evidence generation, we found the Myeloma UK group, which undertakes several research programs, among others the Health Service Research Program, which aims to really better understand the needs and experiences of people with myeloma, and it informs how the disease is treated and managed, shaping how patient care is designed and delivered. Some of the initiatives from Myeloma UK are basically collaborations with other institutions, like for example NICE and EMA, and have different objectives really, varying from exploring the roles, needs, and perspective of myeloma carers to understanding more in-depth patient preferences for different benefit and risk outcomes in the treatment of myeloma. So really a bunch of different initiatives with different aims and different collaboration partners. So this is also very, very important to keep in mind. In the next and last chapter, let's have a look at framework of patient engagement. So the Health Technology Assessment International, which is basically a global scientific and professional society for all those who produce, use, or encounter HTAs, has developed values and quality standards for patient involvement in HTAs through an 18-month international research process. So really going in depth and trying to really find the most important values and quality standards. For example, values like relevance, fairness, equity, legitimacy, and capacity building. Relevance, why? Because patients have the knowledge, perspective, and experiences that are unique and contribute to essential evidence for HTA. Fairness, as patients have the same rights to contribute to the HTA process as other stakeholders. Equity, by looking to understand the diverse needs of patients with a certain health issue, but balancing against the requirements of a health system that tries to distribute resources fairly among all users. Legitimacy, contributing to the transparency, accountability, and credibility of the decision-making process. And capacity building, so the patient involvement processes build really capacity for patients and HTA organizations to work together. In terms of quality standards, of course, there must be a clear strategy that outlines the processes and responsibilities for those working in HTA. There must be appropriate resources to ensure and support an effective patient involvement in HTA. There must be training for HTA participants and staff, but also training for patients and patient organizations to really make the best out of it and empowering them to best contribute to HTAs. And then patient involvement processes must be really regularly reflected and reviewed in order to continuously improve the process. So in terms of framework for patient involvement, patient-centricity has different domains where the patient can be involved in HTAs. It's about the level of involvement, and it's about dissemination, consultation, or participation of patients. The stage of involvement, so if it's about early phase, scoping and priority setting, for example, going through the evidence assessment and dissemination of HTA decisions. Of course, the patient type, so which patients are able to contribute to this process, if it's lay patients, patient experts, or patient advocates or groups. And also the data collection methodology, if it's interviews or focus groups, sometimes questionnaires and surveys, and sometimes direct participation of patients. So let's now have a look how this framework works in different countries with focus on Europe. Starting with Germany, the situation is that leading nationwide advocacy groups are entitled to take part in the discussions and submit petitions within the HTA process at GBA, but they have no right to vote. So currently we have 4 organizations that are entitled to appoint patient representatives within the GBA. And since 2008, there is an executive department of patient involvement with the GBA that also organizes really advanced training for patients and symposia to continuously try to enable patient representatives to familiarize with the structure within the GBA, but also from a content perspective to empower them to make more informed decisions within the process. Looking at France, there has been a very interesting development from 2008 until 2016, starting in 2008, where the HAS has recognized the patient association as experts, enabling to participate in debates or during meetings. But then after only 5 years, the TC, so the Transparency Commission and the National Commission for Evaluation of Medical Devices and Health Technologies, debated the relevance really of patient association participation in the drugs and medical device evaluation. And only last year in 2016, HAS started really to pilot a scheme involving patients really and try to involve them in the assessment of drugs and medical devices. So really process that lasted several years, but which is going definitely in the right direction. I guess NICE in UK is probably the most established process and where the process is really clear and where patients are involved in NICE appraisals, and patient experts are invited as consultees and can really provide input into both the scoping process, appraisal process, but definitely also as well in the final recommendation. And patient experts also attend the appraisal processes to answer different questions and really clarify issues around the submitted evidence. So really an established process here, probably the most advanced and established one among the countries we've been looking at. For SMC in Scotland, there is since 2014 the PACE, so the Patient and Clinician Engagement Group, which really is a new stage of the assessment process involving patients and clinicians. This process is only reserved for end-of-life or orphan or ultra-orphan medicines for rare diseases. And the manufacturer, basically, if following a not recommended decision, can request a PACE meeting. And the PACE group really includes one patient or care representative. And in a study, in an analysis conducted by PRMA Consulting, looking at 20 products assessed by PACE between May 2014 and June 2015, we found out that 15 products were recommended or recommended with restrictions, and only 5 were not recommended following a PACE meeting. Looking at Ireland, since 2016, the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics, which performs most of the HTAs in Ireland, aims to collaborate increasingly more often with the IPOSI, the Irish Platform for Patient Organizations, Science and Industry, particularly when input from patient groups is required. And the NCPE provides on their website even a patient group submission template, which really summarizes the information that the patient group who would like to participate had to consider during the assessment of the technology. And here it's interesting to note that in 2016, patient submissions were undertaken in almost 40% of the full HTAs completed, especially in cancer drugs and orphan drugs. And all but one of the products with a patient submission were recommended for reimbursement by the health service executive. So also here a very, very positive development of involvement of patients. So now it's time for a short summary of what we have been looking so far and some thoughts, general thoughts from our side. We have seen that there is really a convergence in understanding the concept of patient engagement and patient centricity in the healthcare industry, where we have really multiple stakeholders, meanwhile recognizing the importance of patient involvement as an integral part of the drug development process that will really, at the end of the day, improve patient outcomes and quality of life. We have areas like drug development and regulatory approval, where patient engagement is certainly encouraged and widely implemented. And there are, on the other hand, opportunities for greater involvement of patients and their representative, for example, in HTA and market access decisions. Concerning the experiences that the industry has made, there are certainly several initiatives which have been undertaken, for example, patient involvement in HTAs or even real-world evidence generation, but these vary significantly depending on the countries involved and the HTA agencies. So looking at all these, we would like really to challenge the healthcare industry to think about the patient holistically at different stages of the product life cycle, to really make sure that patient insights are considered and implemented for enhanced value generation and market access.
Great, thanks Giovanni. As you've been talking, we've had several questions in, so apologies if we don't get round to all these questions. So the first one relates to, how do you think the industry can empower patients to be an active part of the HTA process?
That's a very interesting question, David. I think that the best way to empower patients and patient representatives to be more active part of HTA process is really to train them, to find ways to train them and really make sure that the patients are knowledgeable and know the HTA process in the different countries, specific of course in which country they are have been asked to contribute, and really trying to understand the processes so well that then during the discussions about evidence assessment they are really able to contribute at best.
Okay, thank you. So as far as you know, have patient preference studies been accepted by HTA agencies?
So this is really a good question and a hot debated topic, because patient preference studies are normally considered during HTA decisions and the HTA processes, not always with a significant impact on the decision. For example, in Germany, this has been a long process in the last several years, and we have seen EQI coming up with pilot projects to validate two methodologies, especially the discrete choice and the analytic hierarchy process, to gather patient preferences for HTA assessments. And the experience so far shows that these data are definitely considered, and if you plan to gather this data, it should be done with these methodologies, otherwise it will not be accepted by IQWiG. But it remains open to what extent GBA will really consider this data against other data, more relevant data for efficacy and safety, for example.
Yeah, I think we've seen a couple of examples where GBA has actually used the EQ5D VAS and accepted that as a patient-relevant outcome in a couple of assessments. And obviously patient preference studies from a utility elicitation perspective are much more commonly accepted in cost effectiveness hierarchy type countries. Another question here relates to, within a pharma company, which groups should be interacting with patient advocacy groups, and how do you see that changing over time?
Yeah, definitely there have been in the last several years structural changes also within pharma companies, where special functions like patient relation or patient affairs managers have been appointed to really be dedicated to the to contact and keep the contact to patient organizations. In terms of involvement within HTAs, I think it's important to always see what kind of activity are you planning, and definitely include these functions, which are really mainly responsible for the for contacting patient organizations, but also include other departments, like definitely for HTA's market access or HUR, and surely also make sure to include also legal and compliance, to make sure that the partnership is set up right from the beginning.
And do you see that changing over time as we're looking, as we're on the verge of this potential nexus of patient advocacy, HTA access, those worlds colliding, not colliding, but coalescing? Do you see that responsibility changing over time?
Oh, I do think so. Yeah, I think we are moving in that direction, and it's not anymore one or two functions. Like, for example, years ago it was mainly the clinical department taking care of the relations with the patients, but now it's pharmaceutical companies also understand even more that it's important to include other functions in the process. So definitely it's changing in that direction.
And I can imagine that creates a few tensions internally.
Oh, yes.
in companies as well. So a question here that perhaps I'll take. So developing PROs may be cumbersome and expensive. What's the cost of not including PROs in oncology from a HTA perspective? Well, that's a good question, and I think we've seen the world move on that quite rapidly over the last 2 or 3 years, as a lot of the HTA agencies are focused not just on the quantity of survival, but also the quality of survival as well. So we've seen several examples in Germany and France where oncology agents have been downgraded or had, from a benefit assessment perspective, or had low ASMR scores because of the AE profile and the quality of life impact. So I think it's really important to make sure you've got the right data for the right discussion with the right stakeholder. Developing PROs, that's a whole different ball game, but use legitimate, well thought out, commonly accepted instruments where possible, and the payers will be rigorously assessing those in the context of survival and adverse events. And I think the other part for that is, and it's going to become even more important as we move more towards a world of combinations where cumulative AEs are going to be more important, the whole piece of AEs and how that relates to quality of life there is going to play even more of a role there. Giovanni, do you think we are today at the stage of true patient centricity as opposed to stronger or improved patient engagement?
That's a good question. I think it's more the second one. It's a stronger patient engagement, but I think we are not yet there with patient centricity. I think that all different stakeholders within the healthcare system and the industry are understanding this increasingly and are trying to change things. What definitely is still missing is a sort of way to share best practices among pharmaceutical companies. For example, there are a bunch of very, very good examples of activities undertaken by pharmaceutical companies for the sake of patient centricity. And I think one of the key things will be really set up a way to share more these experiences, these initiatives, to really learn more from each other and really improve at the industry level this appetite for patient centricity in that sense.
Okay. One question here then is, do you see a potential role for patients within the context of payer advisory boards?
I think that this is a good point, and I think that certainly organizing patient advisory boards with patients and patient groups is a first step in the right direction to really include them in different activities. There are examples of including patients, for example, within ad boards for developing real-world evidence generation. And certainly it's at least in some countries, it's a good idea to have advisory boards including different perspectives, the perspective of the patient, the perspective of the payer, and to see really how these differ and how payer, for example, can learn from patients and the patient perspective.
Great, thanks. So we've got two questions, and I'm gonna combine them a bit. So one asks about, apart from patient preference studies and PROs, what additional patient-centric evidence would you recommend to include in a dossier? And I think the key part there is to think about it from a dossier, but also from the other stakeholder perspective. And then a related question is, at what time point in the product life cycle should the patient involvement begin?
Well, in terms of different data that can be included within submissions and dossiers, I think certainly patient preferences and PROs play a major role. Data on quality of life and other measurements seems to really be the ones driving the decisions, or at least influencing the decision. Certainly also different kind of experiences about the disease awareness, product experience. Certainly also what I said before about real-world evidence generation. This is a big one. I think that including patients already in the dossier, or let's say including patients for developing real-world evidence within the dossiers will be in the future, in the next few years, a key component. And really, as I said before, through advisory boards, try to get the most out of these insights.
Yeah, and I suppose one point there, Giovanni, is as the science becomes ever more complex in the landscapes we're working in, it becomes even more important to make sure the payer understands the impact of the disease, the MOA, and the impact on outcomes as well. So the whole opportunity for patient centricity to factor into that education becomes a big piece as well.
And I like very much this question about the optimal time. And to be honest, I think that there isn't an optimal time, or better said, the earlier the better. So from my experience also in previous roles and collaboration with patient advocacy groups, I think the earlier you start with setting up the partnership, the earlier, I mean, in the product life cycle, the better, and you will have the most out of it, because you can always consider this partnership as a long-term partnership, trustful partnership, where you can get the most out of it also in later phases of the product development.
Great. Okay. There was another question around RWE generation, but I think we've covered that. Yeah, that's all those questions covered then.
Okay.
Okay, with that then we'll thank you very much for your time. If there are any other questions, feel free to drop us an email and we will come back to you. And we look forward to hearing any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.